Hello, welcome to another episode of Bunny Hugs and Mental Health here on YouTube. I'm your host, Todd Runnebaum. Make sure to hit subscribe and like and share and comment and all that stuff. Hey, this episode is with Dr. Tim Lewis, and he's written a new book called A Son's Reckoning with Personal and Collective Trauma in America. Now, his story is fairly tragic. His father suffered from PTSD from World War II, and eventually his dad killed his mother and then took his own life. And so Dr. Lewis, his book is all about that and about PTSD and trauma. So without further ado, I give you Dr. Tim Lewis.
I grew up in Kansas City, Missouri, sort of the heart of the Midwest.
Chiefs. Oh, the Chiefs fan.
I know, it's amazing after all these years. I always heard the whole time I was growing up, the Chiefs were coming back, but they didn't come back in the 70s or 80s.
Or 90s.
So, yeah, it's kind of stunning to see all the attention.
Anyway.
And yeah, so I in my book that's just come out last week, it's called Daddy. I talk a lot about growing up. And I didn't really recognize at the time, it wasn't part of the conversation, that we were all experiencing trauma. My father was a trauma survivor. He landed at D-Day during World War II. And he's almost 50 when he had me. So I had a much older father, kind of out of sync with other kids my age. And my father actually started out as his secretary. And so I was the result of an affair they had. He already had 4 daughters. And my mother had a daughter, although she was much younger. She was 23 years younger than my father. And so I was what they now call a blended household. And I was, by far the baby. Growing up, with a father who expressed a lot of rage, directed primarily at my mother and sister.
Sorry. There's a bit of a delay, so it's weird cutting you off sometimes. But it wasn't called a blended family back then, was it? Or was there a name for it?
No, it was just the divorce rate was, really, my grandparents, my mother's parents really were shocked and appalled when she divorced. There was a lot of rejection at the time. This was scandalous in the mid-'60s. And so, it was unusual. All the kids I grew up around, there were not even that many divorces in the 70s. So it was unusual. It was a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Sorry. And then you're talking about your dad and his anger.
Yeah. So he, was incredibly emotionally abusive to my mother. And really nothing she could do was right. It was a lot of walking on eggshells when I was growing up. And so none of us could really breathe when he was around. And, even though he, because I was his only son, who had come along very late in life, I think he made an extra effort with me. But, seeing how he was abusing the rest of my family, I could never really develop a close relationship with him. I just naturally sided with my mothers and sisters in dealing with him. And so there was I think it grew into a really extreme sense of isolation for him.
Did you could see that he was trying to be closer with you because you're the only son, and then you purposely, you were like, I don't know, maybe you were scared of him, or you had you were intimidated by him, and that's why you pushed away a little bit?
Yeah, it was very frightening. I come to learn as an adult that in his first family that he was, quite physically abusive. And so it was, it always felt like it could spill over into physical abuse. So the threat hung over us. But I think, emotional abuse, a lot of people will come to me as new patients and say, I wasn't hit, there was no sexual abuse, but then they'll talk about similar backgrounds of and this kind of intense emotional abuse, fearing for your safety or your physical or emotional safety, um, really develops kids who are, either want to fight back, can be very aggressive in meeting that, like my older sister, or like me, you just want to withdraw into the background and disappear as much as possible.
Hmm.
But yeah, the whether physical or emotional abuse or a blend of the two, it leaves really significant scars on people, as we know.
Mm-hmm. So even the emotional abuse, could that cause? I mean, people are throwing around CPTSD,
Hmm.
um, that around a lot, and whether, like, I'm not a doctor, so maybe it's justified, but uh, is that something that can be spurred into people's
Oh,
brains
most
from?
definitely.
Yeah, yeah.
Most definitely. I kind of circle back and diagnose myself with complex PTSD, or it's also known as chronic PTSD, which is relatively new. PTSD diagnosis didn't come out until 1980. And then, there was really this issue of people, there was a time frame set down with PTSD that, okay, well, you'll get better within a year. But what about all those people who did not get better in a year or 20 years? And then there's this whole other syndrome that's associated with complex PTSD that's about relational issues. There can be a really powerful fear of abandonment from these early scars, for example, that can make it difficult to be in relationships with people. That they can, sometimes be labeled as borderline personality, is often an offshoot of this. I certainly, in the aftermath of what happened with my parents, which I think we'll get to, in the aftermath of that, was behaving in, very borderline sorts of ways, pushing people away when what I really needed most was their support.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask if trauma and PTSD. Well, I mean, maybe not the PTSD, because the trauma creates the PTSD. So then the trauma would also create other maybe personality disorders that our brain is kind of maybe genetically already kind of in limbo, waiting for trauma to happen so that it can create something. I
Hmm.
don't know if that made any sense.
That's fine. But what do you mean by limbo? At what
uh,
point are they in limbo? Are
well,
you thinking?
you're predisposed with your DNA to maybe um, have, it's a combination of um, nature versus nurture. So
Oh,
is the trauma is obviously the nurture part, but the nature part, are you predisposed to some of these personality disorders, and then you know that's all. You know what I mean?
yeah, yeah. So yeah, certainly they found genetics plays a strong role in depression, for example. And there's also the concept of intergenerational trauma, which is getting a
Mm,
bit more attention. I think that some of the science is still out on that, the hard science, but there is evidence that for example, Holocaust survivors, that their children, have. Some imprinting in their DNA from that experience. And as a culture too, I think having experienced trauma of the Holocaust and then the entire history of uh, pogroms and so forth. So yeah, I think that there's intent, growing interest and study in how these things can be passed down to us a biological level.
mm, mm-hmm.
And so then you hook that up with, like you said, nurture, and it's like adding fuel to the fire. So so that, I
Mm.
think that's why, a lot of people have different reactions. Somebody who grew up in, an emotionally or physically abusive household, they're not all going to develop complex trauma or PTSD.
Mm.
In reality, only a small percentage, but nevertheless, on a scale of the population of the U.S., it's a large number.
Right. Yeah. So what is the difference between, say, complex or, um, yeah, complex PTSD and say just trauma coping or trauma bonding, or is that
Mhm.
a symptom of PTSD? Bad coping mechanisms, or
Yeah, trauma bonding is a term used kind of loosely to talk about, two people who've had experienced, some type of, you know, terrible experience. It might be trauma. When we're talking about PTSD or chronic PTSD, there's, a certain list. There's a criteria in the DSM and the ICD-10 where you kind of have to check the boxes to officially fit that diagnosis. I think
right?
that there's kind of a, it's interesting in researching the book, the evolution of the idea of trauma. It now just seems very commonplace that we talk about trauma and its role, and terms like trauma bonding have emerged. But going back, even 50 years ago, that was a concept that was really rejected by and large by the medical establishment. I mean, it's always been a situation where people who have had trauma, others will deny the reality of this experience. Uh, the soldiers, from the Civil War on, were exhibiting symptoms of PTSD. There was no diagnosis, but they were often called cowards or shirkers. And as I think people are aware, a lot of times these veterans were just kind of left to deal with their symptoms on their own.
Hmm. I'm thinking more. So if somebody's gone through a pile of trauma with their family, abusive parents or whatever, um, and then they, as an adult, they're having trouble with addiction and they have, generalized anxiety disorders. They have low self esteem. Would that be considered CPTSD, or is that just, symptoms of trauma? If that
I think it depends on the severity and
right, okay.
depth of the symptoms. I mean, everybody experiences, a range of emotions and challenges, and I think that in terms of CPTSD, people are, often find themselves stuck in these feedback loops where they're reliving memories of what happened, or really stuck in, regret, pain, grief. About something that happened, 20 years ago. As I talk about in my book, my parents went on, when I was 28, my father actually shot my mother and committed suicide.
Hmm.
And I was the only other person in the house when this happened. I was downstairs. And so,
So you heard the
this,
whole thing?
yeah, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay,
I
okay.
heard the shots. I didn't realize at the time they were shots because there'd never been shots fired in my house. But
Right,
my
okay.
father had guns around the house, and I knew that. Um, I had worried that this was a possibility, but since he'd never, I'd never seen him physically become violent. It seemed like you just don't know. You kind of know. I talk about in the book, and don't know. And so hindsight's 2020, and I see all the signs there so clearly now. Um, and so, excuse me. So, I think that experiences like that can, in my experience of it is that I really became trapped in this experience and was not able to move on for many years. And so then, in trying to deal with those symptoms, like repeated memories, extremely low self-esteem, very pessimistic. As I mentioned earlier, this can manifest in PTSD in terms of relational issues. Uh, I after a certain point, people couldn't handle me because I was so deeply depressed. I was over medicated by a psychiatrist at the time, and people really pulled away after the first couple of years. And I think that can be another hallmark with CPTSD. Um, Eventually you wear a lot of people out over the years.
Mm.
I think when a crisis happens, like with PTSD, people hopeful, people are more apt to rally around. Um, but yeah, I think, in my practice, it's my focus is working with people with CPTSD. And, I see a lot of isolation as a result of, living with these symptoms.
Did you have sleep issues too? I know that's kind of a common issue.
Nightmares, certainly in
Yeah.
PTSD. Uh, and I slept a lot, and I see that a lot in my patients too. It can be an escape uh, from everything that's going on. And, a lot of times you'll be put on medications like I was. And I think, don't get me wrong, I think medications can be helpful. I'm still on an antidepressant, which I've been stable on for many years. But yeah, I was over medicated, and I think you were talking about the 90s here too, where psychiatrists really overprescribe things like Xanax and Klonopin. That can, using it 2 or 3 times a day can turn somebody into a zombie.
Hmm. So how did your father go from, I'm assuming he had probably complex PTSD and probably just
Hmm.
regular PTSD as well. How did he go from, how did he take that jump from being verbally abusive to murder and suicide? Was it progressive, or was it just an instant, like kind of a
No, there was
jump?
no waving guns around. I think, he was 76 when this happened.
Mm,
I think that uh, the years took their toll, that he felt increasingly isolated. We, wanted him to get help. We never did anything to set up an appointment. uh, and uh,
sorry, what year was that?
uh, uh, Probably a couple of years before this happened. Uh,
What year did it happen though?
what year did it happen? 1993.
Oh, okay. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
We've come
so
a
it's
long way
been a while
since then.
now. Yeah, and it's been
Yeah.
a while. It's taken me a while to even think that I could write a book about this. It was not something
Oh.
that I imagined being able to do.
Hmm.
Um,
But you were talking about, you were trying to maybe get him some help, but in 91, I mean, that was not a lot of people were, that wasn't even a, it wasn't a common thing like it is now. People seeing therapists and counselors and stuff. So,
yeah,
yeah. So
right.
you don't have any
Yeah, it would
guilt
have been
issues
like,
about
well,
that, do
you
you?
need. No, I don't feel guilty
Okay.
about it. I feel regret that certainly that things turned out the way they did.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and so I mean, I was very close to my mother, and it's she was relatively young when this happened, and I talk in the book a lot about domestic violence, and I didn't. didn't really frame that at the time, that we were this family affected by domestic violence, which is, really so common, but often so hidden in
Mm-hmm.
our culture. Um, and uh, and a lot of people are growing up under these circumstances, or have lived through them and have moved on. Some people go on to repeat this abuse, that, as they say, hurt people will go on to hurt people. And certainly not all do, but I talk a lot in the book about, what is it? What I think that's what you were trying to get at. What was this extra thing? What happened that pushed my father over the top? And I think, it was just a collection of issues that built up over the years. And I think he held a lot of very rigid ideas about masculinity. Um, that he was this very kind of traditional, I provide, and everybody does everything else, and you should be so grateful for me. I mean, he provided a very nice middle class uh, lifestyle for us. He was a contractor. He came from a very poor background. He lost both parents, when he was a teenager. And so, he really was remarkably able to build that identity, um, but really had no idea about what was involved with the kind of the emotional labor of being in a healthy relationship with people.
Mm-hmm. And I was just talking to someone else the other day. I can't remember who. It doesn't matter. I talked to a lot of people, but about war veterans, World War II veterans that like never talked about the war. Like they came home and it was just off
Mm.
limits. Like we do not talk about this. And I mean, I can't think of a more harmful way to deal with trauma than to just not talk about it. And so then, yeah, it comes out in other ways, anger or drinking or abuse. And yeah, that's horrible. But at the same
Yeah.
time, I mean, I mean, your dad fought on D-Day. Like he helped free the world. Like that's amazing. So I'm sure, I'm sure that sat over him too. It's like, I'm a hero for God's sakes. And my wife burnt my eggs, and then that could be, I don't know, like I'm just trying to put my
Yeah, the
mind in that kind of
narcissism that
thinking.
can come from that too. Yeah, I think could be very narcissistic. Not that he doesn't deserve, the recognition for the bravery.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, these guys didn't have a choice. I mean,
Well,
they
yeah, that's
they
right.
were drafted, and that's where they were sent. And in researching the book, I mean, the slaughter uh, uh, that he witnessed, and 30% of his unit did not come back. So he did not talk about that. He had this, like I think a lot of World War II veterans, they gave them these wooden footlockers, and that was kept in the basement. And maybe once every year or two, he would pull it out, and he'd have the souvenirs in there.
Mm,
The gun he actually used was a Luger that was a souvenir from World War II.
mm,
But he had a Nazi flag in there, some hand grenades, um, and but he never had the language to talk about this. And I think it was probably too horrific, that I think, part of it is that they don't talk about it because they don't want to horrify, their family. They don't want to expose them to that. But yeah, the silence of dealing with this, and I think sort of the generation he's from, trying to have this mask of kind of hyper competence, being in control, the man, it can crush people.
mm-hmm.
I mean, the expectations are so wildly unrealistic.
So I have a question. What was your dad's relationship with his dad?
I don't know,
Mm,
because his father died. He was about 14 years old, and I believe it was a heart attack. But it was
Oh,
another
okay.
thing that he didn't talk about his childhood. He never talked about his mother. She died when he was about 20.
Mm,
Uh, and so I just have in trying to research the book, I have to resort to census data to really kind of piece together, going who my grandparents were, who my great grandparents were, and it yeah, it's kind of almost lost to the mist of time.
mm,
But I pieced together enough family stories to get the idea that my father was himself, I believe, abused by his father. I believe there was a lot of emotional neglect growing up. He was, when he did talk about himself, it was kind of like he was this kind of scrappy troublemaker who was always pulling practical jokes. But you kind of uncover a little bit, why would a boy be reacting that way? And I talk about in the book, I had like somebody like that was with me through all elementary school who, it was very obvious he was being abused at home. He would, kind of come up behind you and slap you over the ear. Kids just don't react violently for no reason. And
mm,
I don't think he was acting out for no reason. It's also made
mhm,
more challenging because he was an only child. Um, so by the time I came along, by the time my older sisters came along, there were no witnesses to his childhood. And I think he wanted it that way. I think he liked to control the narrative.
mm, mm, mhm. You kind of mentioned the word narcissistic a little while ago there. Do you think he maybe had some narcissistic traits or undiagnosed?
Oh, yeah, I think most definitely. But I think think about it as kind of a defense of how small and vulnerable he felt. So a
Hmm.
lot of times people can puff themselves up for the world to make themselves appear much bigger because they feel so small inside.
Hmm. Yeah, I've talked to a couple of people diagnosed with NDP on here, and it's always interesting that um, when you think of a narcissist, you think of someone that's very. You kind of mix up narcissism with like being vain, but it's actually just a
Mhm.
huge lack of self esteem, and so they have to overcompensate for it and stuff. So yeah, it's very interesting, and it's usually well, what the other people I've spoke with anyway, it was kind of a trauma based triggered the personality disorder. So yeah, it's kind of
Yeah.
fascinating, really. Yeah.
And the price of living with that, I think that they feel a lot of pressure to keep that up, either consciously or unconsciously. And so it can erupt in a lot of irritability, anger, being very touchy, like my father was. It can, it's kind of sometimes as narcissist, it takes very little or to nothing to set them off.
Right. Right. So now that you've written this book and you're a psychologist and you've done a bunch of healing, as someone who's also, I've gone through suicide attempts and addiction issues and stuff. And do you
Mm.
feel like you're maybe healing or stopping the generational trauma, and you're healing like the whole next line of lineage of your family tree?
I
Well, actually,
hope
do you have
so.
kids?
I'm actually gay. I have an adopted daughter.
Oh, okay.
Um, and yeah, so yeah, I certainly think about my role and how I treat her. And I talk about in my book too, my grandfather, my mother's father, uh, was a victim of a lot of physical and emotional abuse when he was growing up, and he was this very gentle man, very warm, very loving. And so, that was an important question for me: is how do people, do they make a choice? Like, I'm never going to be like my father. I'm never going to do that. And I think, a lot of times that is the case, that if you've been through this, then a lot of people swear, I will never let somebody else feel that way again. Unfortunately, a small subset of the population, they are so pulled into that they just repeat the pattern for a lot of different reasons. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I have been healing for many years now. It took, the better part of 10 years to get more on track. In that 10 years, I talk about, using a lot of, I was drinking, I was an alcoholic, I was popping a lot of prescription pills. Um, and, uh, and so as you probably know, it takes time. You got to strip that back before you can then deal with, the actual stuff that you're responding to. It is self-medicating, I think, in so many situations like my own. You're just trying to deal as best you can. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and, I had a lot of therapy. Um, but I think it was a lot of lifestyle changes too, in terms of, over the years, going back to school, going to graduate school after this. I didn't start until my late 30s. I was in no I was in no condition to be able to do it before that. And so being able to use myself in new ways, to be able to help people to learn about psychology and, what may have been going on with my family, to learn about how people tick, how we work, learn about ideas like that. It really helped to orient me and ground me, to a place where I was able to, set my life up in a way where I now have a, very stable long-term marriage. I have a good career. In some senses, I've been very lucky with the timing of this. Going back 50 years, who knows what might have happened. I got a lot of good help, a lot of help that, may have made things worse at the time. Like I talk about the psychiatrist and the over medication. Um, but yeah, I have been lucky, but I've also worked very hard to put my life into, something that I feel proud of, that have some meaning and joy. Um, and so that's, also what I really love helping people to do. Um, because people dealing with trauma, they recognize in most cases how bad things are, how they're recognizing how far they are from how, they want their life to really be. And that's incredibly depressing, because you're feeling like, how will I ever get to these things that I dream of? And so, the layers of problems that accumulate over an initial trauma can be so powerful.
Mm-hmm. And to go through, like, I'm assuming for you, you went through a traumatic event plus the CPTSD, so you had to deal with kind of both. You had to deal with a very tragic event and then also deal with this complex PTSD of, the abuse and the mental abuse and emotional abuse. Did your father know that you were gay before he passed, or was that something you?
We knew, but it was not something we ever discussed. Uh, my mother was kind of the mediator, and uh, that was something I think they discussed, and I discussed it, openly with my mother. Um, and I brought friends around and people I was dating. from time to time. And, I think it surprises a lot of people that there was not sort of an active pushback on his part, which I think it also speaks to like this privileged status that I had with him. But I think it must have affected him deeply. I think at the end he felt like an utter failure.
Mm,
Uh, his family didn't love him. He'd done so much in his life, in terms of building his uh, construction business, and the issue of the being a veteran, and having fought. I think he felt completely unappreciated,
hmm.
and that's the real tragedy.
I'm picturing, like, I have an image in my head of what your father, the kind of person he was, and I'm thinking of a rough and tough construction worker who fought on D-Day, has nothing but daughters, and then he finally has a son, and you guys can't have this connection, and then later in life finds out his son is gay, and yeah, I mean, which is obviously no problem, but I'm thinking back in that generation and that kind of thinking, and yeah, I could
A
see
fail,
how.
yeah, it's another failure.
Yeah, but
And let me add, I was not the most functional person at the time when this happened either.
okay.
I was getting by waiting on tables, and I'd gone to college. I was very lucky to that they sent me to college, and but I was, yeah, I was not in a place to be able to really build a good life in the years leading up to their deaths. And,
Mm-hmm.
I was also this was the time of AIDS. And
Mm-hmm.
so while this was happening with my parents and after their death, I was also losing a lot of close friends,
Right,
uh,
right.
even though we were only like 30 at the time. So
Yeah.
that's, I think, just to quickly, I hadn't said that before, but I think CPTSD is this layering on of traumas over the years. Um, and so I think that's another thing that distinguishes it from just, the traditional idea of PTSD.
Right.
Um, and so, people are dealing with layers and years of different types of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Which, it's, I mean, I'm assuming everyone on Earth has some form of trauma, some sort of complex trauma.
Being human can be traumatic at times, huh?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I kind of, in my brain, I look at it as more like there's acute trauma, and then there's, oh, what's the opposite of acute?
The opposite of acute.
Yeah. It's like
I don't know,
sudden,
like,
or like this stretched out kind of
oh, yeah.
trauma.
Okay. So they talk about that. Yeah, there's a word for that. There's like shock trauma, where, like, if you're in a car accident, uh,
Mm-hmm.
or, there's some single event like a fire, and, you see people maimed or burned. And
Mm-hmm.
then
Or a
there's,
school shooting or something.
right, exactly. That's a shock trauma, like a single incident. Most trauma is, more subtle than that.
Yeah.
And, it is an accumulation of emotional experiences. Sometimes it is a threat of, regular threat of violence. Um, living,
Exactly.
I think with, well, yeah, I mean, we could go on and on here, but yeah, there are. There's the shock trauma, and then there's the kind that add up, accumulate.
And then there's the generational, which is, so yeah, it's nice to see that you are well and healthy and functioning as a uh, person, because you've gone through so much, your family's gone through so much. Are your siblings in the same boat as you, or some of them still dealing with
Mhm.
long-term PTSD?
It's a mix. It's
Yeah.
a mix. I think we all carry this weight, and I think the healthy of the healthy ones are, it takes less and less of a central place in your life as the years go by, as it should.
Hmm.
That you're able to kind of look up from that, that trauma, that experience, that's everything, and build a life. My sisters are uh, generally, yeah, from 4 to 15 years older than me. And so they were at different places in their lives when this happened. And I think, the sister that I'm closest to, she had already had children and a family. And so,
Mm.
I think uh, having had some of those things in place helped to stabilize a bit more. Uh, Compared to me, who was just kind of still out there in the wilderness um, when this happened.
Mm. So yeah, they've already, like you said, you kind of affected some of your relationships and things, and they were already somewhat settled with
Hmm.
partners and stuff.
There's
Okay.
also not a huge tradition about, we talked about this a lot when it happened, but I think the drift over the years has been to, not really talk about it much at all. And so
Oh.
this book has, really kind of stirred up a lot. And there's, generations that have been born now in my family that weren't alive when this happened, and are now young adults. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out as they read it.
Oh, so you haven't even seen the full kind of
No,
results in your family by opening up this
yeah,
wound.
I've kept it pretty close. I've kept it pretty close. I started in this writing this in 2017, and then yeah, there's been yeah several
Mm,
years of trying to get this project actually out there. Um,
right.
After
Well,
the writing was actually done.
well, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out with your family, I guess, and what kind of feedback you get from them. Or do you think there's some of the younger family members that had no idea this even happened?
They know it happened, but
Oh, okay.
it was never really discussed. I don't think that it was talked about in any detail. I think there's an avoidance of
Mm,
wanting to talk about something so horrible, and I think that uh, we, while we kind of understand or each have ideas about why he did it. I this book was really a process for me of becoming more clear about what might have been happening for him, that built up and up and up to end in such a horrific act.
hmm And I suppose, like, I mean, there must be a lot of, or maybe there wasn't, shame attached to this too. Like, if you talk to someone whose father was a murderer, there's probably a lot of shame in that. But it was also, you're it. Yeah, it's a complex thing having you know this trauma in your family, because you have
It's
empathy for your
very
dad, but at the same time you have resentment towards your dad because he also took your mom, and it's oh yeah, ooh, yeah, it's yeah,
It's
ooh.
weird. A photographer came by here. They were doing an article on me in the San Francisco Chronicle, and the photographer came later after the reporter, and he's kind of reading this work order, and it's a synopsis, like a 2 sentence synopsis of the book that's saying, very. And he's saying very casually, his author, his father murdered his mother and committed suicide. I'm like, oh my god, and it's just there is a way.
You wrote the book, but it was still shocking for you to hear it.
Yeah, and there is still that shame because it can really put people off to bring this up. They don't know how to react.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, people say, "Oh, I'm so sorry about that." But then, yeah, it's like, oh, you can't stand there and go into all the dirty details, and so it can have the effect of pushing people away.
Mm,
So there can be a sense not just of shame, but of which I don't really have so much shame anymore, but more like I don't want to upset people
Mm,
with this information. But
mm-hmm.
I feel like, in the book, it's important that I upset certain people that are dealing with, traumatic situations, and people who are have a loved one who's dealing with trauma. Um, that I want to bring some. As I said before, there can be a great sense of isolation if you're going through this, or if you're close to somebody who's going through this. So I hope to tell through my story, and a lot of I think some new information about PTSD, that people can orient themselves a little bit better in this experience, and have some ideas about things that might help beyond what they've already thought of.
Mm-hmm. Uh, Dr. Lewis, I have a segment on my show. It's called That's Some Bunny Special. It's a
Hmm.
segment where we chat about who cooperated in your mental health journey and helped fill your emotional tank when it was low. This was brought to you by Co-op. um,
Right.
eh, yeah. So, is there who is there? Would you say consistently for you through all of this?
Well, that's been kind of the problem, is that there wasn't, and that made things a lot worse. But eventually, uh, I did find a therapist, who's sadly passed away now, but who really, really helped me. Her name was Molly Sullivan. She was a psychologist, and she, uh, I think, provided me with an understanding uh, that I'd only experienced with my own mother. There was such a care, and acceptance, that really helped me heal. And I think I was able, as a result of what happened, I lost trust in myself and the world. And so through that one relationship, I was really able to help reignite some trust in myself and other people, which I took, like in all good therapy, I took from that one small relationship, and was able to build on in the outside world.
Hmm.
And so I'm so grateful that I eventually was connected with her, and was able to benefit from her knowledge, and really the art of the therapy that she performed.
Hmm. Is she the influence? Does she influence how you talk to your clients and treat your clients?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I've gone really far in the direction of talking a lot about personal stuff in this book, which
Mm-hmm.
most therapists are, really keep their personal details very close. I don't think that she um, just told me certain details about herself that were in just to make herself feel better. But I think that you can use certain details of your history in therapy at the right time to help people uh, feel understood, um, to understand the depth of the compassion that you're trying to convey, to help people feel less alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very powerful having someone that's in your role that has the same kind of life experience or can relate and have not compassion and empathy because you've gone through it as well. So yeah,
Mhm,
that's definitely when I worked in addictions. That was a very powerful tool too. Was people
mhm.
knowing that you had this life experience. And again, no offense to anybody that works as a psychologist that maybe didn't have huge traumatic events, but yeah, it because
Yeah,
everybody heals differently, and for whatever reason they go towards certain people for healing. So yeah. Anyway, I always feel
exactly.
bad saying that because there are some people that, that don't have the life experience that have the schooling,
Right. Right, and there are like psychodynamic orientation, you don't really, you're kind of being a blank screen for them to project their thoughts and feelings about you, and that can be very, very helpful. No
Hmm.
denying, but I've learned I work in a way that's more directive, giving more kind of concrete feedback about things that have helped people in similar situations,
Hmm.
because I needed that so badly. I was spinning and I needed some orientation.
Do you want to just tell people where they can find your book?
Yeah, I'm on Amazon, and the book is called Daddy. And Yeah, you can also find me at my website, drtimlewis.com. And at Medium, I have a pretty popular spot where I do blog posts about mental health and trauma. So it's Dr. Tim Lewis at medium.com.
Be sure to subscribe and to like this video. You can listen on Apple Podcast and Spotify. This is Todd Rennebaum saying, make your beds and take your meds. Keep watching for more interviews with incredible people telling their stories of resilience and adversity with mental health and mental illness.